All right, everybody, we're going to get started now. I want to welcome everyone here in person and also those of you joining us in the virtual audience. Today I'm very delighted to introduce Natalia Umaña. Natalia is joining us from the University of Michigan today. She just came in from Ann Arbor yesterday. She originally did her undergraduate and master's studies at Universidad de los Andes in Bogota, which I've actually visited, not officially, and it's gorgeous. Then did a PhD at the University of Maryland with Nate Swenson before doing a short postdoc with Liza Comita at Yale, and then off to an assistant professorship at the University of Michigan in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, where Natalia is today. Natalia's research investigates tree diversity, functional traits, and the roles they'll play in structuring plant communities, and also their responses to global change. And she'll be telling us about some of that work here today. So, welcome, Natalia.
Thanks so much for the introduction. So, can anyone hear? Yeah. So, yes, today I'm going to talk about the role of variation, especially the variation within a species. The role of trying to understand the high diversity and dynamics of tropical forest. And I like to start my talks by showing a photo of the types of systems where I work. So this is an aerial photograph of an Amazonian forest in Colombia. These forests are well known for the high levels of diversity, the high number of species. These are also very important systems in terms of sequestering CO2. And that process or that function of uptake CO2 has been negatively affected by climate change. So ultimately, the questions that I try to address through my research are related and how we can understand these forests to project how these systems are going to respond to climate change. And in addition to the great diversity in terms of the number of species that we find in these systems, there is another dimension of diversity that is also quite relevant for me. That is that these forests also have a great diversity in terms of form and function. And this is not super obvious from this photo where everything looks green and kind of very homogeneous. So I have this another slide here where each photo represents a different species showing different fruits and flowers from, again, tropical forests, and the species that are shown in this slide are only the species that are consumed by fish. So actually the functional diversity is much larger in this forest, and hopefully this is a good slide to convince you that in addition to the high number of species, functional diversity in the systems is also quite high. And this brings me to a central topic of my research, that is the use of functional traits to address my question. So functional traits are characteristics that we measure on organisms, in my case on trees, that provide information on how these organisms interact with their environment, how they uptake different resources, and as that we hope that these traits predict some of the variation in performance that we observe in this forest. So the framework that I proposed to understand communities by using functional traits is this one that I'm showing here roughly, and that I'm going to use over my presentation today. So we have a variation in environment here represented by variation in water, soil, and light that are mainly kind of the three factors that plants care about. And that variation in environment will have an impact on the distribution of traits. And we expect that those traits will determine the performance of different species. So one species with a particular combination of traits will probably have high growth, survival, and recruitment under one particular environment compared to other ones that will have different combination of traits. So that variation in trait composition will result in variation in performance that ultimately will result in a variation in abundance that will be reflected in a change in the community level composition. So what I think is powerful from this approach is that by measuring properties at the individual level, these functional traits, I can understand mechanisms at other organizational levels, such as communities, or beyond that, ecosystems. And one of the advantages for these traits in plant communities is that these traits represent key fundamental trade-offs for these plants. So one of the best known trade-offs that we know from these communities is the trade-off that represents the variation between resource conservation and resource acquisition in terms of how plants use and metabolize carbon. So this trade-off shows the variation between two main traits, the metabolic rate associated with carbon, maximum photosynthetic rate, and the ability to retain that carbon that here is represented by the variation in leaf lifespan. And basically what we observe is that plants show this negative relationship that indicate that plants cannot simultaneously maximize these two traits. So in one hand, we have a species that maximize the retention of resources because they have these leaves that last basically forever, typical succulent leaves. But then the cost associated with that strategy is that they have relatively low maximum photosynthetic rates. And then in the other extreme, we have opposite type of traits where species maximize their photosynthetic rates, but then the cost associated with that is that they have a pretty fast turnover of leaves and they cannot retain those resources for a long time. So what is the evidence that we have from these in nature? So this is a paper that shows that species across the globe, including species from all the different biomes, tropical forests, temperate forests, deserts, tundra, everywhere, right? They show these very tight correlations among traits that represent these trade-offs. And these are some of the correlations that they show there. So all of these are leaf traits that are related to the conservation and acquisition of resources. And we see again that there are these very strong relationships among all these traits. But then one of the characteristics of this study is that each of these points here represents a different species. So that means that if we have, let's say, one trait axis here, right, each of these different species here represented by different colors and with different abundances will be only represented by a single point in that trait axis. And that is not necessarily what we observe in nature. Nature is naturally diverse and populations showed a lot of variation. So actually what we should expect to observe is something that looks more like this, where each of those different species is actually represented by a distribution of trait values, and sometimes those values overlap across different species. And this is an example of how much we can observe that variation in some leaf traits. And there is some evidence from previous studies that have shown that that variation within a species is quite substantial and also depends on the trait that we are evaluating. So the examples of the studies that I'm going to present today are ultimately motivated by the question of what is the role of these additional variations? Should we expect that everything that we observe across a species is directly translated at the within a species level, and therefore we just don't need to care that much about this within a species variation, or there is something additional that we can obtain from these additional variations so we can refine the functional framework and increase the predictability that it promises. So for today, I'm going to present three projects that, again, are kind of based on this framework that I presented before. The first one will be related to the question out how environment impact traits, but then taking into account this within a species variation for broadly distributed species in Puerto Rico. The second project is related to only variation in performance, but that taking into account that ontogenetic variation from seedlings to trees, which is quite important for these forest systems where trees are long-living organisms and can last hundreds or more years in the forest. So I want to for this project, I wanted to understand that variation in demography across the entire life cycle of these organisms. And then the last one is the one that tries to scale up the effect of traits from individuals to community level and see how much those traits actually match some of the patterns that we observe at the community level. So for the first project, there are some previous studies that show that yes, traits change along environmental gradients. And the idea behind that is that environment operates as a filter. So some species that have traits that are not a good fit for those particular conditions along this filter will be filtered out, and those that have the traits that are good for acquiring those resources in that particular range of the environment, right, are the ones that will persist. So what we expect is a change in the traits along the gradient, because at each point along this gradient, the traits that are a good fit for that environment will be different. So what we observe is something like this. And what has been traditionally quantified is that for this type of relationships, each of these points, again, represent different species. And this comes with the assumption that typically all the variation that we observe within a species is just the same, but smaller than the variation across species. And this makes sense when we are talking about species that have narrow distributional ranges. But for species that have long or wide distributional ranges, maybe that's not the case, right? So how much this additional potential variation that we expect to see in these widely distributed species actually helps and is consistent with the variation that we observe across the species. And related to that, I mentioned before that traits typically show these trait-trait relationships, right? So the second part of this project was interested in knowing how much that within a species variation is translated in the same type of relationships. Yes, when we take into account that the within a species level. So basically what we would expect could be something like this, where we have, let's say, trait 1 and trait 2, that across the species, across all these different colors, right, we observe a positive relationship, which indicates that probably these two traits have a kind of a constraint that makes them form this positive relationship. Then what we would expect to see is that if the same constraints operate within a species, these relationships should be consistent, something like what we observe here. So for the study that I'm proposing here, when I'm studying species that have wide distributions along environmental gradients, right, we could expect something similar. So we have trait 1 and trait 2. The black line represents the variation across the species, across the entire environmental gradient. But then when we observe what happens within a species, we would observe similar type of positive relationships, right? Indicating that the trade-offs that operate across a species are the same as the trade-offs that constrain the variation within a species. However, we could have a different scenario where, let's say, we observe that positive relationship across the entire gradient, across a species. But then when we take a look at what happens within a species, maybe those type of relationships are not the same. Perhaps, so what this, one of the explanations for this is that perhaps these relationship that we observe across the gradient is the result of environmental filtering, but maybe the traits are not biophysically constrained, so there is no reason to expect that those type of relationships should show up at the within a species level. So for this study, I had these two questions, right? Like, what is the magnitude of that trait variation for this widely distributed species? And then how does the strength of trait-trait relationships changes across and within a species? So for this, I studied 3 species that are widely distributed in an elevational gradient in Puerto Rico. This gradient goes from the pre-montane rainforest at low elevation and to a cloud forest at high elevation. So it is quite an important variation in environmental conditions. I selected the 6 species that had the widest distribution along the entire gradient. And along this gradient of 1,000 meters, I collected 10 individuals per species at each station that was every 50 meters in elevation. And the traits that are collected were all leaf traits, again related to this previous trade-off that I mentioned, but also some traits related to water transport. And here are some of the results. So these are the results for the first question out, like variance partitioning, what was the magnitude of that within a species variation across and within a species. Each column represents a different trait, and the different color represents the different levels that I included. So basically, what I'm showing here is that the variation within a species was quite substantial for these widely distributed species, indicating that if we are not considering that within a species variation, we will be subestimating the potential responses of these species to future environmental conditions or, to different climatic conditions. So we should not necessarily assume that everything that happens across a species is always larger than what happens within a species in the case of broadly distributed species. Then for the second question, I had this prediction that the trade-offs and the relationships between trait probably would be the same at the 2 levels. And I found some support for that. These are some of the relationships that were consistent across both levels. The black line represents the relationship across the gradient, and the different lines represent the relationships per each of the different species. But then what is interesting is that I found also some support for this other prediction that I have here. For some of these relationships, the traits might not be necessarily related to each other in terms of function, so that is expected. Again, I think that probably what is driving that is that the environment is selecting these traits in one way, but those constraints doesn't exist within a species. But one result that was kind of surprising to me was this one here. This is related to specific leaf area and leaf nitrogen content, which are 2 traits that are part of this previous trade-off that I mentioned before, the acquisition and conservation trade-off. We expect these 2 traits to be strongly related and working together to achieve the same function related to carbon processing strategies. And these traits typically relate positively to each other at global scales across species. That is also what I'm showing here. But then within some species, that relationship was not existing. So what I think it is happening here is that the carbon processing strategies involves multiple traits, and different species are changing different traits in order to cope with the different conditions along these gradients. So there's not a single way of being acquisitive, basically. Basically, different species, right, by varying different traits, may achieve the same type of functionality. So to summarize this part, widely distributed species have a lot of variation, and we should take into account that variation if we want to understand how these species will respond to future environmental conditions. Without that, we will be subestimating these responses. And for the second part, the weak trait covariation that I observed within within a species for particular traits that should be biophysically linked probably indicates that there is this possibility of a species achieving the functionality by modifying different traits. Then, for my second project, I was interested again in kind of integrating and understanding the variation in performance in demography, taking into account the different stages of these tree species. So there is this well-known trade-off that operates on plant communities that describes the variation between growth and survival. Is known as the slow-fast continuum, where in one case we have species that show slow growth but have low mortality rates, so they attain high survival rates, and those are the slowest species. And on the other hand, we have the opposite strategy, where we have species that grow fast, but then the cost associated with that is that they typically have high mortality rates. And there is a wide evidence showing that this trade-off is operating on plant communities, right? But typically this has been shown for plants that have shorter life cycles. So in this case, I wanted to integrate the whole life cycle of these trees, from seeds to adults. And for this, I use long-term demographic data that has been collected again from one of my field sites in Puerto Rico. So for trees that were what we call the juveniles to the adult trees that were larger than 1 centimeter in diameter to the maximum size, we use these models to describe growth and survival. So this was in collaboration with Jesse Needham, who is a demographer and who has been proposing these models, which take into account the explicit variation in these demographic rates, how those demographic rates change with size. So this is one of the models for survival for one species, and this is for growth. And based on these models that again were explicitly including the variation in size, we selected a number of parameters per each of the species in this forest that characterize their demography, their growth, and their survival. Together with that, we also collected information on seedling performance. So in this forest, we have been monitoring seedling dynamics for a long time, every year. And with that, we evaluated the variation in performance, the species performance, taking into account, again, the variation in size and also the variation in the neighborhood composition. So at the seedling stage, the composition of conspecifics and heterospecifics is quite relevant. So we took that into account when modeling performance for seedlings. And we also included some measurements of fecundity by evaluating seed production per species and seedling recruitment. So after all, we have all these group of variables, right, that represent variation in survival, growth, and fecundity from trees, seedlings, and seeds. So kind of having the whole life cycle of these species for multiple species in this forest of Puerto Rico. And what we expected was something that will look something like this. So this space, right, represents the demographic space for this species. And what I was expecting was something like all the variables associated with growth will probably low towards one side, and the variables associated with survival would low towards the opposite side, indicating that this axis represents that slow fast continuum that has been frequently observed in other studies. And then independent from that axis would be the fecundity variables. And here is the result that I found. So this is the demographic space that overall represents 82% of the variation in demography across all these species. I'm going to talk first about this y-axis that we call the seedling to adult survival. So this axis represents the variation in survival from seedlings to adults. All these vectors, again, are kind of pointing toward the same direction, suggesting that overall, if a seedling has a high survival, then the adult probably will have a similar high survival, right? There is a consistency in the survival over ontogeny. But surprisingly, this axis was not related at all with growth. The second axis, which is this one that I'm showing here, was the axis that showed a relationship between fecundity, that are these variables that are loading toward this part of the axis, and growth towards this other, towards the other extreme. So basically, this is kind of showing a new trade-off, a new relationship among these demographic variables, where species that have a high fecundity typically have slow growth, and these are, and also small stature. So these are typically shrub species for this forest of the family Rubiaceae, Palicoria, and Psychotria. And in this other extreme, we have the species that grow very fast, that are very tall, but then they produce low amount of seeds. So why is that we are not showing that slow fast continuum? How we can explain this lack of consistency for this particular forest? So one thing that is relevant for this forest in Puerto Rico is that it's frequently impacted by hurricanes. So when I first went to the forest looked very much like a typical old-growth forest, very dense canopies and dark understories with low density of seedlings, right? But then in 2017, this forest was impacted by a very strong hurricane category 5 that changed completely the structure of the forest and also increased, importantly, the mortality of many of the species. So what I think is happening here, well, first, mortality is increased, but that increase in mortality is not homogeneous across all the species. There are some species that are more affected than other ones. So for example, the species that typically have high survival rates, that have high wood density, are the ones that were more heavily impacted by this hurricane because they are not that flexible and they break. So that increases the mortality, particularly for those species. And also, after the hurricane passes, right, we have that many individuals actually survive, but then the structure of the forest changes completely. The crowns of all these trees have been completely removed, so now the understory is full of light. All these trees that were before under the canopy have this great access to light and can boost their growth. So again, typically slow-growing species can have fast growth rates when this type of disturbance happens. Also, all the leaves that have been removed from the canopy are now on the forest floor, releasing nutrients that can also help to boost either growth or reproduction, right? So I think that probably we need to understand these changes in the demographic space for this particular site in the context of hurricane disturbance, right? Where maybe we are not evidencing that typical slow fast continuum, but it's because this forest is frequently impacted by these heavy hurricanes. And there has been some studies before that have suggested that this is a possibility, that in areas that are heavily affected by disturbance, maybe those demographic trade-offs and the demographic space might change. So there has been previous studies that suggest that the growth mortality trade-off might weaken in areas that are prone to disturbance. What I'm showing here is that probably that trade-off may not only weaken, but other type of relationships among these demographic processes may appear. How general is this is something that we don't know because it's hard to get this long-term demographic data, but it would be nice to see whether other islands in the Caribbean are also showing this type of same trends that I'm showing here. So now, I would like to talk about, again, a project that is trying to understand how the effect of traits at the individual level is scaled up at the community level, and how straightforward is that translation from one level to the other one. But before that, I wanted to thank to many people that was involved in this project, that made this project possible. All of them are Colombian researchers and also people from national parks in Colombia, botanists, well, a huge group of people that made this work possible. So I wanted to acknowledge that first before going into the science. But then, so this project is based on tropical dry forest in Colombia. These forests are different from the typical tropical rainforest because they have a strong seasonality in rainfall. So there is a strong dry season where these trees are stressed by the lack of water. And in Colombia, so the areas that show the distribution of these forests are the ones that are highlighted here in orange, right? And our sites are these ones that are showed in gray color here. So we had a gradient of variation in how strong is this, how strong is the dry season across all these different forests. And also we evaluated, so growth, survival, and recruitment over a particular period that was pretty stressful in terms of water availability. That was El Niño event in 2015. This is one of the strongest El Niño events in the last year. So we thought that during that particular period where we did this study, the trees were heavily affected and stressed by the lack of water. And so from previous publications, we know that the functional space for the communities in this forest are represented by these two trade-offs here. One is the conservative acquisitive trade-off that I talked about before, and the other one is the safe and efficient trade-off that is mainly related to how plants move water. So in the safe extreme, these plants are the ones that have small vessels, so they reduce the probability of having embolism, and so they sacrifice the efficient movement of water by having the small vessels, but then they are safer. If there is drought, they are going to do well because they are not going to form bubbles. And then on the other extreme, we have the kind of the opposite type of traits. These species have typically large vessels that can move a lot of water, but again, they are more susceptible to creating bubbles. And what we expected is that those, the traits associated with these trade-offs will relate to these demographic processes. I'm assuming that in these communities we will show that relationship between growth and survival, showing the slow-fast continuum. And then these two processes, survival and recruitment, will be the two main ones that will determine the variation in local abundance for the different species, which is our second level. So we would expect, I was expecting that the traits that relate to these demographic processes here will scale up and also be related to the variation in population size over that particular period. And then at the last level, if we have multiple species that are showing a consistent change in abundance that have a particular combination of traits, that will result in a shift in the community, right? So for example, if consistently the species that have small vessels increase in abundance over that particular period, I would expect that at the community level, the community from the original census to the second will become overall, will be dominated by species that have small vessels. So basically, that would indicate that all these traits that I'm measuring here at the individual level scale up at the community level. And here are some of the results. So this is the first level. That is showing the relationship between traits and recruitment. So the traits that are shown in yellow are the ones that are representing the safe, efficient trade-off, and the ones that are represented in blue represent the conservative, acquisitive trade-off. So overall, what this indicates, all these different traits indicate that basically the species that had a higher recruitment were the ones that were representing kind of a more safer strategy, small vessels and low conductivity, which makes sense thinking that this particular period was stressful because of El Niño event. And overall, recruitment was mostly associated with traits that represent this safe and efficient continuum. And then these are the results for growth and survival. So again, these two demographic rates were related to traits representing both axes, but overall the interpretation was consistent with recruitment. The conservative strategies and safer strategies were the ones that were more successful during that particular year. Interestingly, the only trait that was consistent across all three demographic rates was wood density, which is also one of the traits that is typically strongly associated with demographic rates in other systems. Now, this is the relationship between those traits that were significant in the previous level, but now I'm related that to the variation in the species abundance. And what we see here is that basically the signature for those traits associated with the safe, efficient trade-off disappear completely, and only the traits associated with the conservative, acquisitive trade-offs are the ones that are showing up. And again, the trend here is indicating that the traits that the species that had more conservative traits were the ones that were successful during that time. And then this is the trend at the community level. And here again, we see that only these two traits showed in blue, wood density and a specific leaf area, are the only ones that are significant. And what this indicates is that communities became dominated by species with higher wood density and low specific leaf area, which again indicates that that communities overall became more conservative during that particular time. So what is explaining, or what are kind of the main messages here? Well, one thing is that to understand how traits scale up to community level is not enough to only consider one demographic rate, right? We had like recruitment was related to a different set of traits that were not showing up in the survival and growth rates, right? So if we don't take into account those additional rates, we will be missing part of the processes that are contributing to changes in abundance and higher organizational levels. Then the other part is that some traits were not easily scaled up across the different levels. So wood density was the only trait that was straightforward and consistently showed some significant relationships across all levels. But the traits that were associated with the safe, efficient trade-off which I thought were going to be very important, especially because these communities were stressed by water availability, were not easily scaled up. So I don't think that this means that these traits are not relevant for these communities or are not actually related to survival. What I think this means, which is something that I think also operates for the first study that I showed, is there are different ways of dealing with drought. So in one hand, we have the safest species, again, the ones that have small vessels that are doing well during that particular time. But then these forests are dominated or have many species that are deciduous. These species drop their leaves during the dry season. They stop working. So that means that they don't need to have small vessels in order to survive during the drought. So maybe those species that have large vessels that would represent the efficient extreme here are surviving well during that particular time. And that is why we are not seeing that strong relationship among these traits and survival. So again, this is suggesting that there are alternative ways of dealing with drought, and maybe this is one of the reasons why we are not finding those relationships, strong relationships with survival. So overall, if we want to summarize kind of the key points from each of these studies, the first one is that taking into account that within a species, variation for widely distributed species seems relevant to understand how species are coping with different conditions, but also seems relevant to better understand and project how these species are going to respond to future climatic conditions. For the second one, these demographic trade-offs might be heavily affected by the amount of disturbance that these forests are having. This is again quite relevant in the context of climate change, where the frequency and the intensity of hurricanes and in general of disturbance is supposed to increase in the future, right? So we need to take into account that probably those demographic relationships that operate in old growth forests that are non-disturbed might not necessarily be represented in these communities. And then the last one is that scaling up those traits, right, is not always straightforward. We have some traits that are like wood density that can be easily scaled up from individuals to communities, but then there are other cases where these traits showed a little bit more intricate relationships. And I don't think that that means that these traits are not related to performance, but maybe that they are representing kind of alternative ways of dealing with a particular problem. And before ending my presentation, I wanted to tell you that in addition to all the work that I have been doing in the tropical forest, I have recently started also, since I moved to Michigan, and now working in Michigan as well. In this case, I'm evaluating what happens below ground. So everything that I showed for this presentation was based on above ground traits, but what happens below ground is also pretty important for plants. Below ground is the root traits allow plants to acquire water and nutrients. So for the projects in Michigan here, we are trying to understand what are the strategies that trees show up when we are looking at the root traits and their mycorrhizal partners. And for this, I'm collaborated with Donald Sack, Inés Ibanez from Michigan, Monique Wimstra, who is a root ecologist, and my student Sam, who is the one who has been leading this project. And well, to finish, so if we go back to the question out, what is the role of this within a species variation? I think that there is not a straightforward. It is not like if we are not measuring that, we can just easily translate everything that has been measured and we know across a species and easily translate at the within a species level. I think that there is important amount of information that we can get from the within a species level that hopefully can refine the predictability of the functional framework overall. And with that, I want to thank you very much for your attention. Also, I would like to thank all the people that was involved and make possible all these different projects that I presented today, and also to my funding sources. And I'll be happy to take any questions. Thanks.
All right, great. Well, we can start with questions here in the room, but I'll also moderate some from online as they come in. And if you can, try to paraphrase or repeat the question.
Mm-hmm.
That's always the hard side. Thank you for such a wonderful talk. So one question I have is, I wonder if you ever think about inter-individual variability and whether or not some of your arguments about about interspecies variation also exist within an individual. And so is there a need to also understand about phenotypic plasticity with some of these traits, or when you look at interspecies, does that normally capture what would exist within an individual?
So the question is about inter-individual variation and whether that is similar to what we observe within a species, or if we would need to do some additional analysis trying to understand that inter-individual. So that inter-individual variation for sure exists. I think that it is pretty relevant for leaf traits in particular. So probably integrating that information. I'm thinking about trees as well. I don't know about other type of plants, but within a crown, we could see easily some important variation in how those traits between the leaves that are in the understory and the ones that are exposed to light. So yes, for sure, that variation exists. What is the magnitude of that variation compared to within a species? I don't know that much. I think that there are some studies that have tried to evaluate that. But yeah, that probably is quite important for understanding in general variation of traits, and that can refine the functional framework. Mm-hmm. Yes?
So following up on that a little bit, one of the things that I get really interested in with specific variation is what is the origin of it? Is it acclimation or adaptation? And that has big impacts on how species are going to handle climate change. And so in your work, how do you conceptualize that? And are we making progress in understanding the origins of that?
Yeah, understanding the drivers is for sure one important part from that. Yeah, I do not test how important is, I do not test how important is plasticity versus just genetic variation. And I think that, for the tropical dry forest, for example, where we are having species that are widely distributed and there are some important physical barriers across these, probably genetic variation has also an important component there. For the trees in Puerto Rico, the thing might be a little bit different, and I think that plasticity might be more important. So the importance of those two different components might also change depending on the site. I do not have that information from my studies, but yeah, understanding like what are the drivers of that variation for sure could help in order to gain some predictability. Yeah, I forgot to repeat the question.
It's super hard. The question was about the drivers of the variation within these species being essentially genetic or acclimation with the same genetics within.
Right, yeah.
I'm going to jump into the question because I have like 100. But I was interested, you have the elevational gradient study. And you see some evidence in certain species that they show some of these trade-offs. You were talking specifically about a conservation versus acquisition trade-off. But some species didn't. And I was curious how much you think that's related to the fact that those are measured with proxies, where it's possible, or I guess, is it possible that there are multiple pathways to getting to that trade-off and some proxies capture?
I think that's the case.
Okay.
I think that that's probably one of the cases. These are relationships that involve multiple traits. And maybe that is one of the reasons that I'm thinking how they are kind of being able to not vary one particular traits and then being still functional for those particular elevations. So I think that that's something yeah,
Okay.
probably that is one of the reasons that I think we are observing that. Yeah.
We don't have any online. Yeah, Vanessa?
I have a question. So you mentioned that some of the trade-offs are kind of broken and with a lot of disturbance, like in Puerto Rico with the hurricanes. Do you think or expect that on old-growth tropical forests, if we increase, for example, more storms or more disturbances, do you think that might also happen, and then we are going to lose some of the predictability of tropical forests, of intact tropical forests?
I mean, there are some studies that have evaluated that, like how important is disturbance in modifying those relationships between traits, and it seems that increasing the amount of disturbance by importantly modify these demographic rates. So probably those trade-offs are not going to show up. One of the works that I presented before that shows that yes, that the trade-off. Yeah, I don't. It's probably that one. Is not a general framework. The one that shows that it is not a general framework, it shows that probably, I mean, not only Puerto Rico, but other forests that are frequently impacted by disturbance are not always showing this low fast continuum. So that's a possibility. Yes, again, the work that I presented is based on only one forest, but I think that this might be a little bit more general, just related to disturbance. Yeah, yeah. I mean, for me, it seems that disturbance can modify the demography of these trees. As I mentioned before, I mean, hurricanes increase mortality, and that is one of the modifications of this that may change how the relationships appear in the communities. So I think that overall disturbance might affect the existence of these relationships. Yeah.
Along those lines, I think I wrote that you said that when you get these big disturbances, it causes this kind of like leveling of the playing field, and that slow growers can then sometimes increase. And to me, like, that's surprising because I think of disturbance as knocking those out and then opening a lot of space for the quick colonizers. And so I'm just kind of curious, like, is it just because light availability is now there, or are both things happening, and is it more of just like a time frame of that occurring? And I'm just kind of curious more about that response.
Right. I mean, there are for sure
If you
these.
could repeat the question.
Oh yes.
Which is a bad question. It's not really a question.
So if I have some better idea of whether those changes, those effects of disturbance actually, like, yes, how much that also increases the probability of finding more pioneer species, and how much is actually boosting the growth of all those growth species, right? Something like that. So for sure, there are some. So after the hurricane, many pioneer species started recruiting, and the forest was full of those pioneer species. But also, most of the individuals survived. Most of the trees that were in the forest before survived, and they modified importantly their growth. I mean, these growth. Together with the projects that I mentioned today, I have been monitoring the growth of trees along the elevational gradient. And during that particular time, they were growing much faster than any other of the previous years or subsequent years, after 3 years after the hurricane. So yes, the demographic rates of those slow growers can change importantly, but also there is the typical pioneer species that will grow fast. Those ones are also there for sure. Yeah.
I have a follow-up on that, and then we have a question online. But I was very curious if you anticipate the like divergence from this typical slow-fast continuum trend to be related to the time since disturbance, or if you think there's been just a shift in the regional species pool and that region just operates differently now.
I mean, I evaluated how consistent were these differences across different censuses, or if this was only a trend that happened only at one particular time, right after disturbances, and it seems that it's consistent across all the different censuses that I had. So maybe this is a way that has been just shaping some differences in their demographic characteristics. This is, I think, that is something that has been, and because the hurricanes are quite frequent, right? Maybe this is just something how these trees are now that are showing this variation in these demographic rates, yeah.
All right. So online, Clive Jones has a question. He says, thanks, very interesting. How species diverse are these forests versus, for example, the Northeast US, where we are now? How do you think this species diversity plays out in your work, and how would diversity underlie the kinds of patterns and responses that you see?
Well, compared to continental tropical forest, the island of Puerto Rico has less species than the continental forest. Compared to temperate forest, probably it has a little bit more number of species. And having more species, I think we have a higher probability of having a little bit more differentiation in those demographic rates. So we are probably going to see a little bit more of a trend or a tendency in these tropical forests that have higher species richness than in temperate forest.
Great. Well, thank you for the wonderful talk, and thanks everyone for the great questions. And we will, and thank you for everyone joining online. We'll have a lunch for those of you here where you can chat with Natalia more about this work right after here. So let's thank her once again.